I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor working on behalf of the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility, which is the Global Coordination for Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. But for the purpose of today's call, I am also the co-chair of the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa, along with CARE International. And I'm happy to see so many participants on this month's Emerging Practice webinar series. So each month, the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa, we have an Emerging Practice webinar where we promote good practice, a new practice, emerging practice from our field practitioners and also from our member organizations. So if you are new to our series, I'm just going to go over a few ground rules. If you could please put your videos off. So stop your videos. We have people calling in from all different parts of the region. And so we want to make sure that they can have the best connection as possible. And you can see in the chat that people are calling in from all over East and Southern Africa and beyond. So if you could please put your videos or turn them off. Also, if you could stay on mute throughout of the presentations. If you have any questions for either of our speakers today, please do write them in the chat. So I will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentations. I will be noting your questions, and then during the Q&A, I will present them to the respective speakers. And the reason we do that is we found that we can get through more questions and then we can group like questions together. So please write any questions that you might have in the chat, and then I will be monitoring the chat throughout. Also, just a reminder, videos off because of the connection, and then also please put yourselves on mute. So thank you very much. I think we'll get started. Today we have two really great and knowledgeable speakers. So we're happy to welcome Jean Ward, who is a global consultant, but also a technical advisor for the GBV AOR's help desk. And they recently published a paper on climate change and gender-based violence, specifically looking at the links. So we'll start today with Jean Ward, and then we'll switch over to Milanoy Coyette, who is the Protection, Gender, and Inclusion Coordinator for all of Africa, working with IFRC. So we'll have some of the theoretical with our paper that was developed by the help desk, and then we'll be able to see how we see that an organization is putting that into practice and what they are doing to incorporate climate change into protection, gender inclusion, and then also obviously mitigating GBV risks as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jean Ward, and you'll see me popping up in the chat to remind people for questions. Other than that, I think I'll turn it over to Jean. Jean?
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. I'm just going to put myself on video for a moment so that I can say hi to everyone. It's great to see some familiar names coming in through the chat for the participants, and also many new people who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. So welcome. It's great to have you. As Jessica said, because we have so many people on, I'm going to turn the video off now. All right, so this paper on the links between climate change and gender-based violence was developed as a request, or developed as a result of a request from UNFPA and from the community of practice members to the GBV AOR help desk. And I just want to say that the GBV AOR help desk is a service that's available to anyone who's working on gender-based violence in emergencies. There was a sense from UNFPA and the community of practice members that we needed to understand more about the basics of the links between gender-based violence and climate change. And so this paper seeks to address those basics. Just see if Jessica, is my screen moving?
Yes, it just changed slides.
Okay, great. All right. So the paper, I want to be clear, the paper is very much an introduction. I'm not an expert in climate change. The goal of the paper was to try and share information with GBV specialists about the core sort of issues that we need to understand related to climate change, how climate change is affecting women and girls differently, and how the global community is increasing efforts to address climate change, and kind of helping GBV specialists to understand what those, who is in the global community, what the global commitments are, and also helping the GBV specialists to think through some of the frameworks and approaches within the humanitarian system that are relevant to addressing climate change. How do these approaches support GBV prevention and response efforts? We're not going to go into all sections of the paper today, but the paper is going to be made available to all of the participants after our session today. So you'll have a chance to review it yourself, and you'll also have access to these slides. There are also, I just want to flag case studies that might be helpful in the paper that really kind of bring some of the issues to light. So the paper itself and our presentation today is just going to start with a basic introduction to climate change. Many of you all already know this information, but just so that we're all on the same page, let's talk about what climate change actually is. Climate change describes the increasingly extreme variation of long-term average weather conditions worldwide around the globe. Climate change specifically refers to the effects of greenhouse gas emissions caused by more than a century and a half of burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, resulting from industrialization, as well as from increased deforestation, fertilizer use, livestock production, that feeds and houses our growing societies. Now, greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, concentrate on the Earth's atmosphere, where they absorb and emit the sun's energy, causing the temperature of the Earth to steadily rise. From 1880 to 2019, the average temperature of the Earth increased by 1.15 Celsius. When the atmosphere warms up, it collects and retains more water, impacting weather conditions and making dry areas drier and wet areas wetter. That's why we see so much variation in the impact of climate change. A hotter Earth means that oceans warm and expand, snow and ice diminish, and sea levels rise, causing a feedback loop that increasingly exacerbates the negative effects of climate change. While an increase in 1.15 Celsius might seem quite small, the temperature band for human habitation is actually relatively narrow, and a 1.15 degree increase is also, we should remember, a global average, representing very significant shifts at different times and locations around the globe. This change has already had a dramatic impact on the Earth's climate. From 1901 to 2010, the average sea level rose 19 centimeters, and by the next century, scientists predict it will rise an additional 40 to 63 centimeters. Now, some of you may have heard about the Paris Agreement, which recognizes that climate change is the common concern of mankind. The agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change that was adopted by 196 parties at the Conference of Paris in December 2015. The goal of the Paris Agreement was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. So some of you may have heard already about the report that came out just yesterday from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This report, which is a compilation of 5 years, the last 5 years of reports on global temperature rises, on fossil fuel emissions and climate impacts, finds that despite progress in policies and legislation around climate mitigation since its previous report in 2014, it is likely that warming will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius during the 21st century. We are currently at 1.1 Celsius of warming, and current climate policies are projected to increase global warming by 3.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. So the report, and I'm not going to go into it, but it provides a nice visual for some of the effects of moving up to 2 degrees Celsius difference from pre-industrial levels, and the sort of impact that will have, the different impact that will have from a 1.5 degree difference. And they're fairly significant. I'm just going to pause here, let people have a look at the slide. So that's sobering news. It's important then for all of us to be on board about what we have ahead of us. So let's try and better understand the types of hazards that we're facing. We can think of these in terms of slow onset disasters and sudden onset disasters. Slow onset disasters are years in the making. The slow onset effects of climate change can be very difficult to notice until it's too late. As the decades go by, a climate can become steadily more inhospitable to a population that's been living in it for centuries. Projections suggest that by 2070, up to 19% of the Earth's surface, mostly concentrated around the equator, could have an average temperature equal to the hottest part of the Sahara Desert right now. Some of the examples of sudden onset events, separate from slow onset disasters, would be things like hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, and heat waves. Although sudden onset disasters are more discernible, easily discernible than slow onset disasters, they can be just as, if not more, destructive. Climate change is affecting more and more people across the globe. Since 2010, slow onset events and sudden onset disasters have affected more than 1.7 billion people. In 2019 alone, 97.6 million people were impacted by 308 disasters triggered by natural hazards, 77% of which were the results of events exacerbated by climate change. The climate change is also impacting humanitarian emergencies. Based on an increasing frequency of such events and the acceleration of disasters' intensity, IFRC projects that around 150 million people annually will need humanitarian assistance related to climate events by 2030, compared to about 100 million now. As humanitarians, we often focus on armed conflict. However, natural disasters cause significantly greater humanitarian crises around the world, even than armed conflict. Natural disasters wreak havoc on communities and societies, and as we know, cause loss of life, homes, and livelihoods, pushing an average of 26 million people into poverty every year. Natural disasters also trigger new displacement at substantially higher rates than armed conflict. For example, in 2016, the rate of displacement due to natural disasters was 3 times higher than displacement due to conflict. Even though climate change will touch every region of the world, its impact will not be the same. Countries in the global south are generally more exposed to climate change related hazards. Those countries that are better able to adapt to climate change will also suffer less. Higher income countries experienced more disasters overall from 2004 to 2013, and yet they experienced less mortality related to the disasters. Researchers estimate that more than 3 times as many people died per disaster in low-income countries compared to high-income countries during that period. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, forecasts that urban areas and rural regions in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia will likely be most severely affected by climate change. And what remains true is that among all affected populations, those most at risk are women and girls. An often cited statistic is that women are 14 times more likely to die or be injured during a disaster than men. So climate change can amplify and accelerate pre-existing gender inequalities. This impact then has a knock-on effect by limiting women and girls' ability to adapt or recover to climate-induced emergencies. A helpful way of understanding the gendered impacts of climate change can be using the ecological model. Some of you all have seen this model as a framework for understanding the impacts of violence against women and girls at different levels. The same model can be used to understand the gendered impacts of climate change and climate disasters on women and girls. These are just some of the examples of the potential impacts on women and girls at the different levels of the ecological different levels of the ecological model that indicate the risk factors that increase the vulnerability of women and girls to climate change. So, for example, at the individual level, age and education, including low literacy, may prevent women and girls from accessing early warning. At the relationship level, domestic responsibilities, including caring for children and older relatives, make flight during disaster particularly challenging. An example at the community level is that high unemployment and gender discriminatory employment practices relegate women to informal work sectors, which can also make them more vulnerable during disasters. And some of the broad societal or risk factors are poverty, economic and social gender inequalities. So now let's look specifically at GBV risks. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on the data that's out there, but as I said, you're going to have access to the slide. So you can learn more about this data when the PowerPoint is shared with you. Many of the risks to GBV for women and girls are the same for slow onset climate events and acute events. But it's still helpful to understand some of the specific pathways to GBV that these different types of climates generate. Slow onset events exacerbated by climate change, such as drought, can increase stress in communities, which evidence suggests leads to more conservative or customary patriarchal practices, which in turn can contribute to more violence against women and girls. In both slow onset and acute disasters such as flooding, cyclones, wildfires, additional workloads for women and girls may mean that they're not able to be as responsive to domestic demands, increasing household tensions that can result in violence. Women and girls might be required to walk longer distances to find potable water, making them vulnerable to sexual assault. Here is a slide that Adish put together that tries to summarize some of the regional impacts of climate change. In 2022, East and Southern Africa was one of the regions most impacted by extreme weather events, driving increased levels of risk and vulnerability. So here are some statistics. We're not going to go into them in detail now, just given the time available. But I want to flag them to let you know that they're here, so you have some data. We do have information, specific information about the differential impacts for women and girls of climate disasters and how those climate disasters link to gender-based violence against them. Despite our understanding of the links, it's widely recognized that there has been limited effort to try and address these links. A 2015 report by IFRC found that during disasters, GBV has been, quote, largely unseen and unheard. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction concluded that, quote, patriarchy is reflected in the lack of gender disaggregated data on disasters that serve to keep female mortality, injuries, and violence invisible. So now is a critical time for all of us working on GBV in humanitarian crises, as well as at the nexus of humanitarian and development programming to ensure better attention to GBV. So just to say that, and I'm just wrapping up now, that the learning brief that you all will have access to talks more about the global actors and the policy environment that it's good for GBV specialists to know and understand. It also talks about some of the important frameworks and approaches that are used in the humanitarian space already that can support response to the impacts of climate change and GBV, like disaster risk reduction, preparedness and contingency plan, and more recently, anticipatory action. Again, we're not going to go into detail, but you can access that information on the learning brief. What I would like to highlight today are some of the key considerations for us as a GBV community moving forward. The learning brief emphasizes that we are at a very critical time working in humanitarian crises, as well as at the nexus, to ensure better attention to GBV and gender equality in both acute and slow onset climate-related disasters. So first, the GBV community must build their understanding of the global, regional, and national systems, policies, and funding streams related to climate change. Because these systems are often included within and guided by development progress, this means GBV actors working in humanitarian crises will need to link to development action. Second, it's important that GBV actors build out the capacity of relevant government partners, such as ministries related to women's affairs, to understand and get involved in climate change action at the national level. This includes influencing climate change policies and national action plans, and understanding how to access climate change funds to support GBV prevention and response. Third, we need better integration of GBV across all frameworks and response actions. Newer approaches to disasters, including climate change adaptation approaches and anticipatory actions, are exciting opportunities to improve efforts to prevent GBV and to ensure comprehensive and safe services are available to survivors. Fourth, we need more information. By promoting evidence gathering on the links between different climate hazards and GBV, GBV partners can not only conduct advocacy related to the importance of addressing GBV in climate action, but can also utilize the data to create appropriate interventions before a disaster or slow onset event has fully struck. And fifth, we need greater investment in system strengthening related to GBV, including supporting GBV coordination, which is chronically underfunded in humanitarian settings, and also ensuring things like girls' education and building adaptive livelihoods. And lastly, and I'm going to stop after this, we need to support women's organizations and networks. We can't overemphasize this as a critical entry point for supporting climate change adaptation and resilience, as well as preparedness. Thank you. Everyone will have, as Jessica said, we'll have time for questions later.
Great, thank you, Jean.
Thank you for that extra time, Jessica.
Thank you. While Millinois is, I think, Jean, you have to unshare. Yeah, there we go. While Millinois is sharing her screen, I want to remind our participants to please, if you have questions, to make them specific to GBV and climate change, because I noticed a few questions are just more generally related to climate change. And this particular webinar is specifically looking at linkages between gender-based violence and climate change. So just keep that in mind. I am noticing or trying to note your questions as well. Over to you, Millinois.
Thanks, Jessica. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Millinois Koyet. I work with IFRC, Africa Regional Office, based in Nairobi. And I work on protection, gender and inclusion. And as I start this conversation, I thought it would be important to just share in terms of how IFRC works. It will help us understand in terms of our work in climate as well. So IFRC is made up of 192 national societies. Those are the Red Cross and Red Crescent globally, which is one in each country as well. So in Africa, we have about 49 national societies that we support from the Africa Regional Office. And national societies are auxiliaries to the public authorities in the humanitarian field. Important to note our role and our relation with government as well. And we work in partnership with public authority based on international and national laws. Our work as IFRC focuses on disasters and other emergencies, including health emergencies, floods, drought, population movement. Therefore, climate is part of our core business as well. And we do provide, basically part of our core business. And our role as IFRC, as the secretariat working with the 49 national societies in Africa, is to provide technical expertise. We provide guidance, standards, minimum standards to ensure that our work, our operations, emergency operations, long-term programs are there to the standards and guidelines as well. So our added value basically is that in each country, we have a national society that has staff and volunteers, and therefore our value lies in our community reach and expertise, where we have branches in each part of the country. We are mostly fast response team in the field in case of an emergency or a disaster as well. And therefore, each national society has established a long-standing presence in the community where it operates, and has earned trust of community members, where even most of our volunteers are part of the community. Therefore, we are always able to reach even the hard places to reach as well. Just to highlight our work on SGBV prevention and response and mitigation as well, is that we do have a joint resolution that came into place in 2015 at the international conference, and the international conference brings together all parties to the Geneva Convention, including Red Cross and Red Crescent partners and other organizations as well. And in 2015, as a movement, we came together and agreed and took note of the fact that we do have a role and responsibility in prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence in emergencies, in conflict settings, and we have a major role to play as well. So this resolution clearly provides what is our role as IFRC, as the national societies, as members of IFRC and ICRC as well. Like I mentioned earlier, IFRC focuses on disasters and other emergencies, while ICRC, which is also part of one of our movement partners, focuses on conflict settings. So as part of this resolution, it does provide guidance. What is our role as a movement in prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence, which is very, very critical, taking into account that we all have a role to play as humanitarian actors as well. And even before this resolution came into place, we had done some studies as well, looking at the relation between GBV and climate. And I'm happy to see that that was also mentioned earlier in terms of some of the areas that we need to look at more as well. So in terms of IFRC, we have developed tools. Even after this resolution came into place, we have developed tools, minimum standards, and we have common approaches when it comes to prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence as well. And also very important to note as well, as we talk about the different national societies in Africa region, even as we look at East and Southern Africa, where each country we have a Red Cross or Red Crescent represented in each country, they're all at different levels in terms of capacity, in terms of expertise, in terms of their approach as well. So we also recognize that national societies are at different levels in responding to this as well. So what is protection, gender, and inclusion? Protection, gender, and inclusion is IFRC's approach to understanding the risks, causes, and consequences of violence, discrimination, and exclusion. So it's the approach that we use in our work, in our everyday work, to ensure that either in emergency operations or in our long-term program, we do factor in addressing the risk and causes and consequences of violence, discrimination, and exclusion. This is very important because we are always asked, what is PGI and how does it work as well in IFRC? So really our work on GBV falls under protection, but of course there are a lot of intersectionalities and relations when it comes to gender and diversity, addressing discrimination, understanding different needs, risks of different people as well. So when we look at protection, where most of our specialized work on GBV falls in, we look at addressing violence and keeping the communities we work with safe from harm as well. We also look at gender and diversity, where we look at addressing discrimination. This is really understanding the different needs and risks for different people, so that our responses are factored and addressing each and every risks and concerns of our communities as well. In terms of inclusion, we look at addressing exclusion and ensuring that no one is left out in our response as well. Really trying to find out who are the excluded groups and what we need to do better as an organization to ensure that they're not left out in everything that we do as well. I hope this helps to at least understand how we work on protection, gender, and inclusion as IFRC. So most of our specialized work as well, because of time, I might not go in depth into it, but how we work in the protection team as well is that we have an outcome. One, we build the institutional capacity on protection, gender, and inclusion. This means internally as IFRC, this includes the national societies who are the main members that form the International Federation of the Red Cross, is that we build the institutional capacity, technical capacity, ensuring we have the right staff at different levels, including on protection, on gender and inclusion. In terms of programming, we do ensure that we mainstream protection, gender, and inclusion in all our emergency operations and in long-term programs, but we do have specialized programs on protection, gender, and inclusion. And this is where specialized GBV work falls in, specialized child protection, safeguarding works as well falls in. And outcome 3 as well, we influence standards, norms, and behaviors as well. And of course, outcome 4 is how we work in partnership with other actors in the movement, and both internally and externally. So in terms of our protection work and climate work, I'm happy also to mention on this call, my colleague who leads the work on disaster risk reduction is part of this call. So your questions are most welcome, and I encourage her as well to chip in and respond to any climate questions with regards to IFRC, as she's part of this call as well, and she's very well versed on the climate work that we do. So in terms of our work on PGI and climate, we have strategically agreed to work together as the climate team in IFRC and the protection, gender, and inclusion team to ensure that in all our climate work, which is the core mandate of our work as the International Federation of the Red Cross, that we cannot do it without including protection, gender, and inclusion, right? And I will not even go back to the statistics as mentioned by Jean in this call as well, as it's pretty clear that we cannot work on climate and forget who's most affected, what are the risks to women and girls, to persons with disabilities, to women and girls with disabilities as well, is very critical as well. And this has been recognized by our climate team as well. And one of the ways we do it in our programs as well is that the climate team, we have a set of tools on enhanced vulnerability capacity assessment. This is really an in-depth needs assessment to understand what are the needs, risks, and concerns as well. And it's ensuring that as part of the enhanced vulnerability capacity assessment, protection questions are part of the questions included, and analysis is also done on specific analysis on protection, gender, and inclusion is part of the enhanced vulnerability capacity assessment. Why this is critical as well is that then it will inform our response plan, our capacity strengthening, it will inform our funding context as well, and in terms of how best we support each country context on any climate work. We've also been doing a lot of capacity building. We have the Africa Climate Fellowship, and one of the things we're looking at doing is ensuring that at the Africa Climate Fellowship that seeks to build climate champions in Africa region, that we do include protection, gender and inclusion, sessions, conversations, training, peer-to-peer learning, so that as much as we are building an IFRC team of Africa climate champions, they are champions on climate who also understand what are the protection concerns, what are the gender and inclusion concerns in climate as well. Therefore, we are building a holistic team of champions in Africa region. Recently, in November 2022, we held the first ever held East Africa Protection, Gender and Inclusion and Climate Summit, where we brought together the national societies from East Africa. And for the first time, we came together and just sat and had conversations on the realities on our work in climate, in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, any work on anticipatory action, what is happening on the ground, what do we need to do better, with the understanding that we have a role to play in ensuring protection, gender, GBV elements are not left out as well in our work, and what do we need to do as well. So this conversation was held over a couple of days, and we're able to come up with a checklist, a proper checklist where the disaster risk reduction colleagues working on disaster risk reduction are able to look at a checklist and work closely with our protection colleagues in country to ensure that as they work on any climate programs or interventions, they factor in what should we not forget as we work on these elements as well specifically. So the checklist was developed together, all of us together as a team. It was not developed by one person, but as a team from the time that we were together to just see how best do we integrate protection, gender and inclusion in our climate work as well. And we also developed a roadmap. We were able to do a roadmap in terms of our learning, lessons learned, where have we come from? And since we have a strategic plan for 2020-2025, what do we need to do for the next couple of years between 2022 to 2025 to strengthen our climate work, to ensure that protection, gender and inclusion forms part of the core of the work that we do. So we're able to develop a roadmap that will guide our work for the next 3 years, and we will review to see where we are at in 2025. So this is something we are continuing to work on as a team as well and monitor, and it's also a form of peer-to-peer learning as well, as we document best practices, as we document challenges that we experience on ground, and also a learning to the other regions as well as we go through this process as well. In terms of documenting stories, where we've seen is a gap in terms of any SGBV work in our communities and climate work. So we've started working specifically with national societies in different countries and working with them on ground directly, ensuring that we have GBV experts on ground with the national societies in some of their anticipatory action programs, and ensuring that we work with them in integrating, for example, child protection in anticipatory action, and really documenting that process to see how that works and letting it be a learning for other colleagues as well. Yeah, so currently we have some national societies that we are working on that as well. And in terms of advocacy and policy efforts, I know we had shared some work we had done together with UNICEF last year at the GBV EOR, in this working group, where we shared on the study we did with UNICEF on gender and GBV risk mitigation, prevention and response, and analyzing the disaster risk reduction frameworks in East and Southern Africa in each country, and what are the gaps when it comes to gender and GBV. Beyond this learning as well from the study, we are moving forward to really follow up on the gaps that we saw from this study as well. And one of the main things we are doing this year in a couple of months is that we are still working closely with UNICEF, and we are planning a roundtable, since one of the main gaps we found is even in the working climate, there is a missing gap where women are missing as part of the conversation, girls are missing as being part of this conversation. And that doesn't mean that there are no women's rights organizations working on climate action. We know that they are on the front line as well. And we are looking towards hosting a convening, bringing together women who are experts and the organization who are at the forefront of climate action and justice in East and Southern Africa with relevant policymakers to also influence various processes happening this year, including the AU Climate Summit. We are looking towards also hoping to influence the Women Deliver Conference and taking advantage of other opportunities happening this year. So this conversation is just to bring some of the policymakers on the table, if it's IGAD, if it's SADC, and seeing how best and having this conversation with women leaders in Africa region, in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement who are leading this work on climate action, and to ensure that they're also part of the voice on ensuring that our climate actions are gender transformative as well, as this has been a gap that has been recognized as well. So just to mention some of the work we are currently looking at as well is being very practical. We're all aware that we are currently responding in the hunger crisis in East and Southern Africa. There's the hunger crisis is one of the major things that we're responding on, and as one of the major interventions as the International Federation of the Red Cross is that we are using cash and voucher assistance and as one of the main modalities in our response as well. And we have recognized that this is one of the areas as well that we are working towards strengthening our response capacity, even as we work in cash and voucher assistance as our main modality of our response in the hunger crisis response. So we are
Illinois, you have 1 minute.
Oh my goodness, okay. So we are currently supporting several countries in the hunger crisis, and we are working with the national societies in country to build their capacity on cash and voucher assistance and GBV as well. So this is one of the areas that we're looking at, and it's really focusing on humanitarian actors, not really specialized actors, but working towards building the capacity of our CVA teams, our operation coordinators, our disaster management teams in the different countries where we are responding to ensure that we take into account GBV risk mitigation, prevention, and response in CVA as well. So we have developed also a lot of resources as requested by national societies. And I remember during COVID, one of the major things as we're not able to travel to different countries was the need to ensure that we have enough resources on ensuring that we continue our work on SGBV prevention and response and mitigation. And we develop different resources that are currently being used by the different national societies as well that are very specific on GBV as well. And happy to share the links. Globally also, we are part of the PGI Anticipatory Action Working Group, where we co-chair the working group together with UNFPA and Plan International as well. And in this working group, we've been able to have different peer-to-peer learnings, where learning from other contexts as well on how anticipatory action has supported access to services for women and girls and work towards mitigating gender-based violence risks as well. So this is some of the work as well we are doing at a global level, where the regional teams are also part of these conversations as well, and really part of our learning, because we've said there's lack of enough learnings for us in the region on how best to ensure that protection, gender, and inclusion is included in anticipatory action work as well. So just sharing a couple of resources as well that will be part of these slides. And that's it for me. Thanks, colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Illinois. Very much appreciated. And we had a lot of people asking for links to these resources. Etienne, I'm referring to you because I know that you were anxious to get some real sort of quantitative statistics about the linkages with climate change. So I want to let everybody know you will get a recording. You will get in your email, since everybody registered, we do have your email addresses. So you will get a link to this recording, and then you will also receive the PowerPoint presentations. So you will get the link to the recording. So we had some questions, some very broad questions that were addressed during the webinar. Sahara, I think, was one of them. So if you'd like to have another listen to the webinar, you can maybe answer some of those bigger, broader questions. And then you'll also have these linkages. I did close the question window a couple of minutes ago, just because we do have a limited time and we already have quite a few questions. So Etienne, your big one was around data. And I'm not sure, I'm going to turn this over to Jean. So the question is, do we have, you mentioned that women are 14 times more likely to be impacted over men, but during your sort of review of data for your work, did you find other good resources that our participants can maybe look into, or other sites where they can get more quantitative statistics around these linkages? So it's about data. Jean, over to you. Jean, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Should I speak?
I'm looking for Jean Ward, our speaker. Yeah.
Okay, I'm listening. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Jean, over to you.
So in the learning brief itself, there is, because people are always requesting data, there is a section that tries to go through available data from different parts of the world on the specific links between increases in incidence of GBV related to climate events. So that's a good place to start. The bibliography will help you identify other places that you can access information about quantitative data that's available. The data isn't being collected regularly, and so that's an issue that we still need to advocate for, is that we need more statistical information in the aftermath of a climate-induced emergency around the impacts of that emergency. But it is being collected by GBV specialists and other researchers who are looking into the impact of these climate-induced emergencies on women and girls. So I would start with the learning brief and the bibliography there. And there's also a new UN gender group on climate change, and I don't have the website for it offhand right now, but it's referenced in the learning brief itself.
Great. Thank you, Jean. I'm noticing people are putting a lot of questions in the chat. I just want you to know that we have closed the question window due to timing, but please do feel free to put them in there. And if people have answers, they can also address them in the chat themselves. Adish, I'm going to turn over to Adish Madho, who is our GBV AOR's Regional Information Management Officer, and who's also been working quite extensively on this GBV and climate change. Adish, did you have something to add?
Thank you. Yes, I just had something to add on the question of data. So when I was doing that infographic on the impacts of climate change on GBV in the Eastern and Southern African region, I came into, I found a couple of research that have been done that do put together data and bring data and with a direct link between extreme climate events like floods and a rise in the number of GBV cases, particularly in with regards to IPV. There's one particular case in Kenya, for example, with a study from 2021 that shows a 60% increase following a flood event that happened in the western area of Kenya, and there was an increase there. Also, I've also looked into the safety audits and focus group discussions our GBV coordinators in the region have worked on, looking at the perception of GBV after climate change. So the question was risen as well with survivors and groups of women and girls. The answer is that there's a higher risk for women, for example, in collecting firewood, as they need to go further and are more at risk of facing GBV. So there's a direct correlation of having to be going further from the village or the places where they normally collect firewood. So that's one thing. During the East, the Horn of Africa's drought event that happened, that is still ongoing, but that happened last year, where it was where the most affected areas by drought also saw a higher number, about 20% increase of IPV were reported in those in the same area. So there are links, direct links to that as well. After Freddy, the cyclone that just hit the Channel of Mozambique and Madagascar, there's been also reported cases directly linked to both food security and food insecurity mainly, and the impact of the cyclone. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do. And we have a couple of research that have been brought together, all these different details. So I'll globally, so I'll put that in the chat as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Adish, for putting that in the chat. I have a question for Milanoy. I'm grouping a couple questions together. We had some questions about the roles of rights holders, and also I'm going to put this together with, can you name some specific strategies in which we can reach grassroots level with in terms of climate change, getting information out, but also mitigating risks related to climate change and GBV. So the questions are about, there was some questions around the role of rights holders, but then I'm going to put that also with, do we have strategies, or does IFRC have strategies in place to reach grassroots level?
Thanks, Jessica. And I'd say, as IFRC, like I mentioned, we are like a membership organization, right? We bring together all the national societies, the Red Crosses in each country. And like I mentioned, we are auxiliaries to government. What this means that we do work closely with government, but beyond that, in our work and operation, the core of everything that we do is ensuring that the community is at the center. Any response work, any strategies that we do, like for example, you've seen I talked about the enhanced vulnerability capacity assessments. This is led by the communities as well. So ensuring that the communities are at the center. One of the minimum standards that we uphold in our work, we say that in everything that we do, we have to ensure communities' dignity, access, participation, and safety as a basic minimum. Meaning in any community that we work with, we ensure their dignity by understanding the cultural context, ensuring that it's the volunteers on ground who are engaging with communities, and ensuring that there's gender diversity in our response teams as well. So even as we engage communities, and not only as beneficiary, but as rights holders with an understanding of what are their needs, their risk concerns, and also solution givers. They're not only beneficiaries, which is one of the things that we factor in everything that we do. So some of the strategies we employ, like I mentioned, we have the enhanced vulnerability capacity assessment, and we have anticipatory action work as well. Most of our anticipatory action work is factored on how we engage with communities from the start to ensure that we have an understanding already of what are the upcoming hazards, because by now sometimes we can predict of any upcoming and what action plans are in place. These action plans are put in place by communities together with national societies in country. And our role as a protection team is to ensure that in our work and in developing action plans, data comes in very critically. We look at data, who's been engaged in the community, who's leading these conversations, where are the women, where are the persons with disabilities, but also ensuring that we understand that we do not work in isolation. We work closely with women's rights organizations, disability rights. This is something that we're also really pushing, especially working with organizations of persons with disabilities as experts to understand what are the best ways in developing our proper action plans in place as well, way in advance. And I think as a movement, what we really emphasize, especially let me just focus now on GBV prevention, mitigation, and response, is the importance of coordination and collaboration with actors. As much as I mentioned that the national societies are at the center, they are in the communities, they're part of the communities as well. And as fast responders, they do get cases gender-based violence. So their role as well is to empower, is to ensure that we have the right technical expertise at a minimum to ensure a survivor-centered approach, that any cases that we get, that as a movement, we ensure safe referral pathways. You know, being part of the conversations largely with other organizations is very critical, and really building up that conversation of not working in isolation, but working in collaboration with other actors at country level. I hope this makes sense.
Yes, thank you, Milanoy. And then lastly, I think I'll take a stab at some of the last grouping of questions, because it speaks to the GBV AOR and their role in implementing or mitigating risks amidst climate change. So we have Christine Appio, who is our regional GBV specialist, whose role is looking at prevention and risk mitigation. And I think I will give you 1 minute, if I could, Christine, just 1 minute, because we are running out of time. If maybe you could explain a little bit about what we're doing to ensure that we are looking at this from a preparedness lens. Christine, just 1 minute to kind of give the viewpoint from the GBV AOR and what we're doing here in East and Southern Africa to ensure that we're taking climate change into account and mitigating risks. Christine Appio?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And apologies, I joined a bit late because I'm also in the SADC kind of regional meeting that has different timelines. So basically, we are, as part of the preparedness initiative in the region, we have developed our GBV emergency preparedness and readiness assessment tool, which was initially piloted in Malawi, but now it's also now being taken up in Madagascar and also DRC. And this is really to enable that the GBV subclusters in country, the GBV actors are able to come up, assess their own readiness to respond to a disaster in case of a cyclone, a drought, and then come up with very specific sort of actions. But we are also engaging with the regional anticipatory action actors, which some of you may know. There are groups of actors that are doing a lot of work in regards to food security, but mainly linked to climate change. And together with UNFPA this year, we are working on preparing to actually conduct an action-oriented GBV in emergency preparedness and response training, targeting different countries that are prone to climate-related disasters, such as Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, Madagascar. And the aim is really to help these countries, including the government institutions and other local actors, particularly women-led organizations in these countries, to have the critical tool and the skills necessary to include GBV response and risk, particularly risk mitigation in the disaster response mechanisms in country, but also in terms of prioritizing GBV in disaster response coordination mechanisms. And we are hoping that as part of this regional level training, there will be sort of a toolkit, including minimum preparedness actions that will be developed by the different countries and implemented back. Thank you, and over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Christine. I think we will close our question and answer time. People are wondering, Christine, about the readiness assessment. My understanding is we're still at the drafting or the finalization stage. And once we finalize that tool, after we have rolled it out in some of these pilot countries, it will be part of the toolkit. So for those who are asking for that particular one. But in the meantime, I highly recommend, we had lots of questions here that could be answered, and you can be supported by your GBV subcluster coordinators in country. So, or else your GBV working group leads. So please do reach out to our colleague, Christine Cabelli. And Christine, you can put your address in the chat. Christine works at our regional team here. If you are unsure of who your counter or your GBV subcluster coordinator or your GBV working group lead is in country, you can reach out to Christine Cabelli and she can link you up with that resource. or you could probably find it online as well. And of course, it's those who are actually implementing GBV programs in country would probably be the most versed on that. So before I leave, I just want to also reinforce that the recording and also the presentations, they will be sent to all of you who have registered. That's how we have your email address. So we're a bit sneaky. This is how you become part of our wider listserv. So if you've registered, we do have your email address, and you will receive an email from our colleague Shiva. We want to thank Shiva for all of her support from our Geneva office. She will be sending out a link to the recording, the PowerPoint presentations, and we'll make sure to also put in there a dishes link to those 40 other resources. Please do follow us on Twitter, and you'll be able to link up to all of the activities and what we're promoting here in East and Southern Africa. And perhaps, Kabeli, you could also put our Twitter link in the chat, GBV AOR East. And actually, Kabeli, if you could do that for me, that would be great. So please do like us on Twitter, and then you'll be get the moment-to-moment updates on all of our activities. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please do join us next month for our next emerging practice webinar. And now that we have you registered, we'll be able to send out these invitations. I want to thank especially Jean Ward and Milanoy Koyet from the help desk and also from IFRC for your great presentations, because I think you can see in the chat, you really generated a lot of thought around this issue. And also for us in here at the regional level and the regional GBV working group for East and Southern Africa, it makes us think about how we can do more on this issue. So please do follow us on Twitter, GBVAOR ESAR. And then you'll be up to date on all of our activities, but of course we'll be sending out invitations for all the upcoming events that we do have. So thanks everybody for joining me, and thanks again to our speakers, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Yes, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks.